Well, I guess the first one is to ask you, your sense of how the response in Delaware to the hurricane was, and it's kind of a rating of how Delaware fared in terms of responding to the situation.
Well, I think we did pretty well. Certainly, things were not as bad as they could have been, and I think we were quite lucky in that things weren't worse. We were fortunate insofar as the storm tended to veer east instead of west, that the storm's wind strength actually weakened instead of strengthened over time. And hurricanes bring a lot of uncertainty. So I think that what we found was that the state of Delaware and many of the other surrounding states erred on the side of caution. They decided to do things in a way that was going to make things safer, generate less risk, and I think it was completely appropriate that they did that.
I was going to say nobody wants to be in these situations, but a lot of times the only way to know if your plans are good is to actually have it to put them into practice. Is that your sense that maybe Delaware learned a lot about how good its plans are from having to go through this situation?
Absolutely. It's a test on particular facets of those plans as well. So, for example, the evacuation from the coasts. Delaware has had an evacuation plan to remove people from those coastal areas, to get them out of the beaches ahead of time. And we saw that transpire as the weekend progressed. And would led up to when the hurricane was supposed to strike. One of the things that I saw on Facebook, actually, the governor's office had a Facebook site set up for people to post questions and for them to respond. They had a communications officer that was actually online answering questions. And there was several postings about the tolls, asking why the tolls were still in place. They were still collecting tolls at the booths, even though a mandatory evacuation was underway. People were complaining that there was a backup at those particular facilities. The communication officer said, we'll look into that, and by the next day at least, those tolls had been removed. So that might have been something that had not been entirely thought through. This was an opportunity to see where some of those problem areas might be, and I would expect that in a future event they would lift those tolls much earlier in order to prevent a backlog.
Well, you're mentioning that brings me to something I wanted to talk to you about later, which is the use of social media in these situations. Is that an emerging area in disaster response, emergency response? Because it seemed like there was a lot of activity in the state of Delaware between the government and other people on social media.
Sure. So on one hand, you see government offices setting up sites specifically for that. You can friend the governor and get information. Of course, there's limits to that because there's only a certain number of friends that you could have on Facebook, so then they began directing people more specifically to additional information on the standard websites. You also have a lot of communication between individuals. So I myself was checking Facebook. I was looking to see what people who I knew in the area who had lost power, and then suddenly my power went out. And you could also get a sense of when power was starting to get back up. We also have to remember, though, that a lot of people don't have access to the internet at all. So this might be a very interesting way and an innovative way to both get information out to the public, to have people communicate with each other, and to get information from the public if you are a responding organization. But there's a lot of people who don't have access, and we want to make sure that we don't miss their needs or their concerns, especially when the power goes out and they don't have access to TV or phone.
I was going to say, so it's more and more of a, another tool in the toolbox rather than something that could be in and of itself a standalone type of tool.
Right. People get information from a variety of sources, some from TV, some from radio, some from telephone, some from the internet, some from calling neighbors or community groups. We want to make sure we hit all of those areas to make sure everybody gets the message.
A lot of situations like this involve coordinating different organizations, coordinating different branches of government, coordinating different levels of government, a sense of how important that is, and it seems like in this case there was a fair amount of that going on in the state of Delaware. Is that your sense?
Yes, and you saw the emergency operations centers start up both for the state, for the counties, also within large areas. So the University of Delaware, where we are today, activated its emergency operations center for the university campus itself. And this is a way for people to come together and share information and also try to build on those networks. You might have one individual that has a presence in the Emergency Operations Center, but they're connected to 7 or 10 different other organizations. It's a way to get that information to the group of decision makers at the table in real time.
I was going to say, it sounded like one of the success stories that they had during this storm was that there was a flooding problem at Kent General Hospital. That information got back to the right people at the right time very quickly, and they were able to respond and stop the flooding before they had to evacuate the hospital. Is that a good example of, that Delaware did have its act together, that they were coordinated in the way that they needed to be to respond quickly, even at the height of the storm?
That is a great example. And the more communication that you set up ahead of a disaster on the front line, the more time you get people sitting around a table and getting that trust built is going to have payoffs in the middle of a disaster.
It seemed like most people did heed the evacuation order. Is that unusual in terms of the way people react to these situations?
I think sometimes you have a disaster subculture that emerges, people who have been through prior storms who say, I've been through that one, we were okay, we're going to weather the storm this time around. They might be concerned about getting back into an area and delay evacuation because they're afraid they're not going to be able to access their property again. I think it's very good that people took the advice of, for the most part, of government officials that got out of harm's way. Again, in this case, we were very lucky. There were a lot of people who did have wind damage, flooding damage, had trees that came down on their property or on their houses as well. So it's better to be safe and sorry than in these situations.
Conversely, and this is one of the things the governor addressed yesterday, is that there is that group of people who looked out their front door and said, you know what, my house is fine, my street is fine, nothing happened. Is there always a worry when a situation like this maybe doesn't develop into a worst case scenario, that people then the next time around say, they overhyped that the last time, and don't listen to the warnings the second time around?
That is a concern, and that's why these days and weeks after a disaster are important to use as a window of opportunity. So even this past week, we had an earthquake tremor here in Delaware in the area. We had a hurricane come through the area, fortunately not hit us directly. But this is a time for those conversations to take place and see what could have happened. Point to the circumstances within the state where things actually were not that well, where there were cases, and that could have been any one of us that happened to be spared in this event, to have those conversations going. So when the next storm passes through, be it this season or a couple of years from now, that people can learn from those lessons and have really sat and had those conversations in their household, within their business or organization or as a community.
And I guess, are there certain things that the state or even just regular people should be looking at in the wake of a situation like this to learn from? Are there specific things that they may want to just look at again and reassess? Well,
testing those key features of what we want to do in a hurricane response or disaster response and see how it actually happened. Were there bumps along their way? Did we rely on some communication strategies or mechanisms that weren't adequate even in the small response? And what if we had a Category 4? How might those fare then? We also need to think about the people who might be particularly vulnerable in these circumstances. So when my power went out at my house, the most that happened to me was I lost some perishable food in the fridge that didn't quite keep. We have friends who had their sump pump stop working, so they had flooding damage. You have other people in this community who have refrigerated medication, who rely on home electrical medical equipment. So having the power go out for 5 hours is really a life-threatening situation. Those individuals need to think about how to prepare in their own households and their communities, and responding organizations need to consider that even when things fare okay, even when we don't get hit by the big one, that there are some segments of the community that are going to be more vulnerable than others.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.